Hello and welcome to Flip Video 28, America Enters the War. All right, today we're going to talk about the beginning of World War II and what got us into the war. Okay, so our objectives here are to understand the course of the early years of World War II in Europe, to describe Franklin D. Roosevelt's foreign policy in the mid-1930s and the great debate between interventionists and isolationists, explain how the United States became more involved in the conflict, and explain why Japan decided to attack Pearl Harbor, and describe the attack itself. So Japan starts to expand. Japan attacked China without a declaration of war, okay? So it used to be that if you're going to war, you kind of announce it. You declare war, and then you attack. Japan, they decided not to declare war and then attack. They just attacked. All right, so they bombed civilian populations and committed horrible acts of cruelty. I mean, they sent the Chinese on marches. It was bad. They even killed 3 American soldiers. While Roosevelt wanted to remain isolated, he saw the potential for being dragged into the war. So in his quarantine speech on October 5th in 1937, he says this: "When an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins a quarantine of the patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease. War is a contagion. Whether it be declared or undeclared, it can engulf states and peoples remote from the original scenes of hostilities. We are determined to keep out of the war, yet we cannot ensure ourselves against the disastrous effect of war and the dangers of involvement." So basically what he's saying is, look, this is something we need to stand up and take notice of. We don't want to get involved. We don't want to be in another war. However, war is a disease. It can spread. We have the Philippines and Guam's not that far off of Japan. All right. So it doesn't take much for Japan to see those islands and go, you know what, I want those. And then all of a sudden the U.S. is dragged into another war. So the fighting in Europe begins. All right. Britain and France sign an alliance to take action if Hitler invades Poland. Okay, so they're seeing Hitler start breaking the Treaty of Versailles. He's building up a military. He's kind of making grumblings of wanting to expand. And so Britain and France get together with him and say, hey, dude, you can't expand. All right. You know what happened with World War I. You are not allowed to expand. Stay out of Poland. Well, Hitler, on the other hand, is more concerned about having to fight the Soviets. He's like, you know, Russia's kind of big and I don't want to fight them. So he signed this Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, all right? So they agreed not to fight each other and to split Poland. So Hitler's like, you know what? Really don't care about that non-aggression pact, this pact that we made with Britain and France. I really want Poland, and I also really want Russia to get off my back. So let's make a deal with Russia. You want to attack me, I want to attack you, and we'll split Poland. So Germany invades Poland with a blitzkrieg, or sudden attack. All right? And 2 weeks later, the Soviets invade Poland from the east. So Hitler's like, yeah, I'm going to do what I want. Well, Europe, like Britain and France, are like, okay, he invaded Poland. We're going to smack him on the hand and tell him not to do that again. You know, like a little child. You know, don't go further, Hitler, or we're going to have to do something. Well, Hitler's like, you know what? I really, really want to expand. And so he proceeds to invade Denmark, Norway, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Okay, these are all smaller countries that don't keep a large military. And it went relatively smoothly without a whole lot of loss of life at the beginning. And then that is when France and Britain started to step up and go, okay, he's going to start expanding like they did in World War I. We're going to have to do something. In May of 1940, Hitler broke through the French lines in the Ardennes and began to take France. Okay, so he was moving pretty quick. And he ended up taking France. And the British narrowly escaped France by the way of Dunkirk. All right, so Hitler has gone through, he's taken France, and he's sitting there right on the channel looking at Britain saying, I want you. So there's the debate. Do we isolate or do we get involved? Okay, so Winston Churchill noted that the war was between ideologies as well as nations. Okay, so we need to look at how the war is the Axis powers of Italy, Germany, and Russia, and Japan, these are all totalitarian governments, all right? These are governments that are run by dictators, okay? They're the ones that are taking away people's rights, and they're saying, hey, look, we're going to tell you how to act, we're going to tell you how to live, we're going to tell you how to spend your money. Well, the Allied powers, Britain, France, the US, we're all democracies, okay? And so Nazi aggression is threatening freedom and rights of these countries, because if they come in, they're ruled by a dictator instead of a democracy. But unfortunately, at the same time, the Great Depression have all eyes focused at home. Okay, so everyone else in America is like, we've got some bigger stuff to deal with. And World War I, it was really deadly and it was really costly. We don't really want to be getting involved in this right now. But FDR is firmly anti-Nazi and wanted to help the Allies. Okay, so FDR is like, look, this is a huge threat to democracy, and we are allies in Europe, okay? We really should want to think about helping the Allies. Well, Congress had passed several neutrality acts prohibiting commerce with belligerent nations. So what this means is if you're involved in war, we're not going to conduct any business with you. Okay, we're not going to do any trade, we're not going to sell anything. But FDR's like, we need to help the Allies. Okay, we need to help these guys out. If we help them out, maybe it'll keep the war in Europe instead of it coming here. So he goes to Congress and he gets permission for the cash and carry. Okay, so it says that we will allow commerce between allied nations if they pay in cash and they carry it on their own ship. Okay, that's the only way, because we're not getting any more of our ships bombed like the Lusitania was. And Roosevelt justified this in his For Freedom speech. So very similar in World War I, how Woodrow Wilson gets elected by saying, you know what, let's stay out of the war, and then gets into the war. Well, Roosevelt kind of did the same thing, all right? So he's campaigning on, I'm going to stay out of the war, but once he gets reelected, he's like, well, we really, really need to support Britain. We really need to support our ally. And so Britain's running short on funds for cash and carry, and they need help. Okay, so Britain's like, okay, well, I appreciate you're willing to help us. We don't have a lot of funds, okay? World War I and the Great Depression kind of wiped us out. We need help, all right? And Roosevelt goes to Congress and he's like, look, the Nazis and the Japanese are threatening Britain's four freedoms, okay? The freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Okay, so these are what he calls, you know, your basic rights that every human should have. And the best way for the U.S. to stay out of the conflict is to help Britain. Well, the solution to that is the Lease Act. Okay, so Roosevelt compared America's situation to the scenario of a fire at your neighbor's house. If your neighbor asks to borrow a fire hose to put out the fire, you don't barter with them. You give them the hose. Right? So that's just being a good neighbor. And so Roosevelt's like, look, Britain's on fire and we have the hose. We have the military supplies and goods that will help them fight this war. They are our neighbor, they are our friend. We need to help them. And so Congress is like, okay, we're going to approve the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941. And it allows America to provide government defense articles as it sees fit, when it thought it was necessary in the interest of the defense of the United States. Okay, so they went on the philosophy of, look, if we support them over there in Europe, they're going to be able to fight the war and keep it over there in Europe. It won't come to American shores. So there's two debates, all right? You got the isolationists, you got the interventionists. The isolationists are like, look, World War I is deadly and expensive. Great Depression requires American attention. If you aid the Allies, you're going to get us involved, just like what happened in World War I, okay? Only way to keep us safe is to stay out, okay? But the interventionists are like, look, Nazis are threatening our freedoms. You know, neutrality acts are going to aid these allies. It's going to help them, all right? So we need to help aid Britain so that we can keep them from bombing us. So why does Japan attack the United States? Why do they get involved with us? All right, well, Japan resented the threats to its power in the region. The U.S. was in the Philippines and Guam. All right, so we have these areas from the Spanish-American War, remember? We support China in its fight against Japan. Okay, so we're like, look, we don't like what Japan's doing. Okay, and then Japan signs this pact with Germany and Russia. So Japan allies itself with these totalitarian governments. And so the US is like, well, we have an embargo against them. We're going to have to do the same thing to you because we can't allow you to have war supplies. So they stopped selling oil, iron ore, fuel, steel, and rubber to Japan. Well, Japan's like, well, we're still going to expand. Hideki Tojo, the Japanese prime minister, tried to negotiate with the U.S. on the expansion, and the U.S. is like, no, we're not going to let you expand. So December 1941, Tojo gives up on the negotiations. He's like, all right, fine, we'll do it my way. So while the Japanese diplomats were still negotiating in Washington, D.C., the Japanese Navy was sailing for Pearl Harbor. Literally, we had diplomats at the Capitol negotiating when Pearl Harbor happened. Okay? They kept it so secret that their diplomats didn't even know what was going to happen. They struck on December 7th, 1941, with the power of 6 aircraft carriers, 360 airplanes, and an assortment of battleships, cruisers, and submarines. So they came with a lot, and we took a heavy toll. Okay, so the U.S. lost 2,500 people, 8 battleships, 3 destroyers, 3 light cruisers, 160 aircraft, with 128 more damage. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was out of commission for 6 months. Okay, so they definitely dealt us a blow, but not all is lost. Most of the important ships, they're out to sea, and we still had submarines. So we still had might in the Pacific, just not nearly as strong as it was. Well, on December 8th, President Roosevelt gave a speech to Congress. He says, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, is a day that will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The facts of yesterday speak for themselves. The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people, in their righteous might, win the war must win the war with absolute victory. So he says, look, they brought the war to our shores. We have to show them that's not okay. So we're going to have to fight. And with that, we have gotten into World War II.